opens lines for the queen and king's bishop, immediately challenging central space and hinting at an aggressive opening. Instantly seizing control of a central diagonal, this Sicilian defense creates immediate asymmetrical pawn tension and sets the stage for dynamic, imbalanced play. Developing the knight towards the center immediately challenges black's pawn structure and prepares for further piece play. Solidifying the center and preparing the development of the bishop, this move establishes a robust Sicilian defense. Opening the center with this pawn thrust immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims for rapid development. Exchanging pawns opens lines. Black gains breathing room while white prepares to recapture with a central pawn. A knight now occupies the central highway, creating dynamic attacking possibilities. Activating the knight directly challenges the central pawn structure and prepares for queenside castling, adding immediate tactical intrigue. Developing this knight to c3 solidifies central presence and prepares for further piece coordination, influencing key squares. Securing the b5 square prevents a knight's intrusion, but delays development, potentially ceding central influence. Securing the d4 knight with a pawn advance while preventing. b5 is a hallmark of this variation, asserting central control and subtly limiting black's queenside expansion. Pushing the e-pawn forward immediately challenges white's central knight, initiating a dynamic pawn struggle and potentially opening lines for black's bishops while also staking a claim on key central squares and preparing to develop the king's bishop. Reasserting central influence, this knight finds a natural redeployment, eyeing the kingside while preparing to contest the e-pawn's advance. Developing the bishop to its most natural square prepares castling and connects the rooks, a crucial step in solidifying black's pawn structure after the advance of the e-pawn. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure now prepares for a fianchetto, aiming to control the long diagonal and add a piece to the attacking force, while simultaneously creating a safe haven for the king after castling. Securing the monarch's safety is paramount, and this castling maneuver efficiently tucks the king away behind a protective pawn shield, preparing the pieces for future central operations and potential queenside expansion. Developing the bishop to its active diagonal aims to contest control of the dark squares and prepares for potential kingside castling, a prudent step after black's king's safety is established. Developing the knight to c6 now places a central piece on an active square, reinforcing d4 and potentially eyeing e5 or even preparing a later queenside maneuver. Securing the king's safety is paramount, a proactive castling maneuver that tucks the monarch away and prepares for potential central pawn pushes. Reinforcing the central pawn chain and preparing for potential queenside expansion, this development subtly bolsters black's pawn structure against white's anticipated kingside activity. Preparing to shift the battle to the queenside, white aims to liberate the rook and establish a stronger presence on the open c-file, potentially forcing black to commit their pieces to defensive positions. Black fortifies the queenside infrastructure, positioning the rook on the semi-open c-file, anticipating potential pressure or offering support for a future pawn push. Unleashing a knight towards the enemy's kingside, white boldly seeks to disrupt black's comfortable setup and create immediate tactical skirmishes. This aggressive maneuver aims to exploit potential weaknesses around the black king, particularly by targeting the f7 pawn. The knight's journey to g5 might force black to commit defensive resources, potentially sacrificing some central control or positional harmony in exchange for king's safety. It's a dynamic choice that injects complexity into the game, shifting the focus from solid development to direct confrontation. The bishop immediately engages the knight, challenging its forward post and aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially create an outpost for the queen on d8. A bold repositioning of the bishop, shifting from its influential diagonal to a more defensive stance, now eyeing the opponent's doubled pawns and preparing to support a potential kingside pawn storm if the opportunity arises. Consolidating the bishop onto a more passive square now allows white to exert pressure on the kingside and potentially exploit the open d-file. Repositioning the bishop to g2 after its initial sortie to f3, aims to rejoin the central pawn chain and defend against potential knight incursions toward the kingside, while also opening a clearer diagonal for the queen. Challenging the center's dominance, the knight repositions to a remarkably active square, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for future action, while simultaneously eyeing the kingside's safety. Redirecting the knight's pressure from g5 back to f3 aims to maintain control over the center and prepare for a potential pawn push with e4, though it allows black's knight on d4 to consolidate its strong outpost. This maneuver feels somewhat hesitant, as white avoids immediate confrontation and instead opts for a more prophylactic approach, bolstering their own central presence while acknowledging the discomfort created by black's intruding knight. The strategic dilemma white faces is whether to actively challenge the d4 knight now, or to develop their pieces further and hope for a favorable opportunity to dislodge it later. The space advantage black possesses is undeniable, and white's present move seems to be a quiet concession to that fact for the time being, prioritizing piece harmony over immediate tactical engagement. Black's bishop, having retreated from the pin and now repositioned, subtly challenges white's knight, creating a potential for a double attack on the e5 pawn should white's nf3 move again. This maneuver, while seemingly passive, prepares to exploit any overextension or miscalculation from white's side, aiming to generate counterplay from a seemingly quiet position. Aimed at unpinning the knight and establishing central presence, this queen deployment hints at a desire to activate its influence on the queenside and potentially support a future kingside attack, all while maintaining a watchful eye on the d5 square where black's knight is so aggressively placed. Sacrificing the knight in this way opens up the g-file for white's rook, and more importantly, eliminates black's active knight that was expertly positioned on f3, forcing a concession. This exchange, while giving up a piece temporarily, aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the queenside or centralize black's remaining pieces with greater freedom. Consider the subsequent pawn advances and how they might exploit the altered pawn chains and open lines. Unraveling the pawn structure, white recaptures, opening lines for potential king attacks, while simultaneously simplifying into a potentially more favorable endgame scenario where rook activity on the open files becomes paramount. Black reaffirms the bishop's post, creating a solid defensive triangle, and prepares to potentially challenge the d4 knight's outpost or reposition the queen's rook. Clearing the path for the queen to potentially infiltrate the queenside, this bishop's repositioning prepares for future piece maneuvers and aims to subtly restrict black's queenside space. The black queen swoops in, eyeing the b2 pawn and threatening to create significant discomfort for white's nascent queenside structure. It's a bold declaration of intent, forcing white to carefully consider their immediate defensive obligations and the long-term safety of their king, which may soon find itself under indirect pressure. This retreat signals a shift in white's approach, aiming to consolidate the bishop's influence and prepare for a more subtle maneuvering game rather than immediate aggression. Instead of directly challenging black's queen, white opts to reinforce the dark-squared bishop's scope from the d2 square, potentially eyeing the weak g7 pawn or simply adding defensive resilience to the kingside. This allows black's queen some freedom, but also creates possibilities for white to create positional pressure by developing the remaining pieces harmoniously. Suddenly, the queen plunges into the heart of white's queenside pawn structure, aiming to disrupt its solidity and create immediate threats, forcing white to reevaluate their defensive setup. Constricting black's queenside pawn structure, this advance sacrifices immediate dynamism for long-term spatial dominance, aiming to starve the opponent's pieces of crucial squares and potentially pave the way for a queenside pawn storm or isolation of the c5 pawn. The bishop now occupies a remarkably active diagonal, directly challenging white's pawn structure and aiming to disrupt white's queenside control. This repositioning injects immediate tactical intrigue, forcing white to address the increased pressure on the b2 and c3 squares, potentially compromising their pawn shield and opening lines of attack. The queen steps onto the e3 square, a seemingly simple repositioning, yet it's a subtle dance to untangle the potential piece entanglement and prepare for a more active role in the queenside struggle. White seeks to activate this central commander, eyeing the d4 pawn and perhaps dreaming of a future swing to the kingside. This redeployment also serves as a defensive measure, reinforcing the d4 outpost and anticipating black's continued pressure along the c-file. Notice how the knight on f3 now has a clearer path, and the bishop on g2, though currently passive, is part of a well-coordinated setup. Consider the implications for black's advanced bishop on c4. Is its prominent post now a target? White is carefully navigating the current impasse, aiming for a gradual improvement in piece mobility and exploring avenues for future initiative. It's a quiet move, but one laden with strategic intent, looking to reshape the battlefield. Exchanging queens here signals a potential shift towards an endgame, where black will need to be mindful of white's passed pawn on a5 and the open d-file. Centralizing the bishop after the queen trade creates a stable, active piece, now poised to influence the d4 and e5 squares, potentially supporting a queenside pawn advance or controlling open files. Re-establishing bishop presence on the d7 square is a prudent step, aiming to improve coordination and potentially contest the open d-file. Initiating a steady march of the rooks to claim the open central file, aiming to generate pressure along the c-file where black's pieces are somewhat congested. Re-establishing a defensive post on d8 offers the bishop sanctuary from the open diagonal, preparing for potential exchanges and consolidating the queenside. Re-establishing the bishop's presence on the c1h6 diagonal offers a flexible repositioning, eyeing potential advances on the kingside while keeping an eye on the d4 square. Sensing an opportune moment, black strategically reinforces their kingside pawn structure with h6, preempting any potential knight incursions or bishop sorties towards that vulnerable flank while simultaneously creating a vital escape square for their king. Launching the knight to the edge of the board often signals an intention to reroute it, perhaps to a more active square like c5 or b6, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure or exploit potential weaknesses on the queenside. This knight's journey might also be a prelude to a queenside expansion, preparing to challenge black's control over the open c-file. Challenging the pawn chain and seeking activity, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's well-organized structure by targeting the weak a5 square and potentially opening lines for counterplay. Pushing that pawn to b3 aims to solidify the queenside pawn structure and prevent black's knight from finding refuge on c4 or b5, while simultaneously preparing to develop the b-pawn further, potentially to b4, to create counterplay and gain space. Sacrificing the exchange here is a bold attempt to disrupt white's knight mobility and potentially create dynamic counterplay, though it concedes significant material for queenside pawn activity. Reclaiming the bishop by accepting the sacrifice fundamentally alters the pawn structure and prepares to activate the remaining pieces towards a more dynamic middle game initiative. A daring pawn grab, exposing the knight to significant counterplay and potentially opening lines for white's pieces to infiltrate black's position if the material is not recovered quickly. The bishop immediately reclaims a crucial outpost, aiming to contest the open c-file and prepare for potential queenside advances. Re-establishing the bishop's influence on the queenside, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's developing rhythm and potentially prepare for a more active placement on a central diagonal. Opening the d-file now aims to activate your rook, potentially targeting black's bishop and creating pressure on the back rank as the position simplifies. Bringing the bishop back into play after a series of exchanges on the queenside, black repositions this piece to a central square, eyeing potential infiltration routes and reinforcing its influence in the queenside sector, which white is attempting to gain traction on. A timely repositioning to contest the central files and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside. Unleashing the bishop to f5 aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces, particularly the rook on c1, by threatening to exploit the somewhat exposed king's position and the weak d4 pawn if white isn't careful. Unlocking the kingside pawn structure now aims to disrupt black's compact defense and create new avenues for white's pieces, potentially preparing for a d4 d5 pawn push to gain central space. The knight's journey to g5 aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakened kingside. But it overlooks the immediate tactical consequence of leaving the d4 square undefended and opening a pathway for white's rooks. Redirecting pressure from the queen side to the king side, this maneuver anticipates black's potential infiltration and prepares to reinforce white's central structure. Shifting the bishop back to b8, the player aims to redeploy it to a more active square, perhaps eyeing the kingside or supporting a potential pawn break later in the game, while simultaneously avoiding any immediate tactical complications that the open diagonals might present. The rook's return to its initial file signals a positional reevaluation, aiming to regain initiative by pressuring black's somewhat passive central pawn. White is seeking to activate pieces that have become somewhat static and prepare for a potential pawn push on the queen side, exploiting the slightly weakened pawn structure black has after the recent exchanges. This might also be a preparatory maneuver to redeploy the rook to a more active square, perhaps the c-file, if black isn't careful. A bold check, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create opportunities to exploit the awkwardly placed bishop on a7. A bold maneuver, seeking to trap the rook and disrupt black's coordination, though it gambles on the knight's safety and ignores potential counterplay on the now open king's side. A bold gamble to break open the center. By pushing the e-pawn, black invites a tactical skirmish and attempts to disrupt white's centralized pieces. This gambit could unleash attacking chances, but it also potentially weakens the pawn structure and creates exposed weaknesses around the king if not handled with precision. Opening up the f-file with this capture offers a crucial dynamic to the ensuing middle game, potentially exposing black's king if white can coordinate their remaining pieces effectively. The bishop's redeployment to a more active diagonal, aiming for the exposed kingside, forces white to reevaluate their pawn structure and piece harmony. The rook's intrusion to the 6th rank suddenly jolts the position, creating immediate pressure on black's weak pawns and threatening a devastating invasion. Recapturing with the rook to e8 immediately challenges the initiative the opponent just seized with their rook on d6, aiming to simplify the position and alleviate the pressure on the e-pawn. Securing the king with a well-timed retreat from potential discovered attacks and central pawn pushes is paramount now, preparing to redeploy the monarch towards the kingside where its safety is less compromised and future central activity might be supported. Shifting the bishop to f5 repositions a key piece for activity, aiming to pressure the c2 pawn and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside, while simultaneously offering an exchange that might simplify the position and ease white's defensive burden. Opening the h-file for your monarch provides crucial escape routes and attacking potential, as your rook now eyes the 7th rank with menace. Unleashing a check, the black bishop aims to disrupt white's rook activity, seeking to exploit the awkward placement of the white king and potentially create new attacking avenues. Seeking refuge from the looming check on the king, white tucks his monarch away to a slightly safer square. A clever knight maneuver disrupts white's pawn structure, forcing a difficult decision for the king. Unleashing the king from its protective pawn shield initiates a daring counter-adventure, a testament to the tactical sharpness of this peculiar position. Swapping off that pesky knight opens lines for your king, but be wary of white's activated pieces. Reclaiming the piece opens up the way for white's rooks to become far more active on the d and c files. The bishop retreats, allowing the rook to gain freer passage along the 3rd rank, a crucial artery for the impending endgame. Regaining the initiative on the open file, the rook sweeps across to the 7th rank, a bold declaration of white's intent to disrupt black's weakened structure and pressure the vulnerable king. The rook sacrifices itself, opening a crucial diagonal for the king, aiming to exploit the discovered attack potential and disrupt white's centralized pieces in the ensuing chaos. The bishop recaptures, solidifying white's pawn structure while opening a clear diagonal for its counterpart on e3 to potentially influence the kingside in the upcoming simplified game. The bishop's retreat to e6 activates it again, targeting the now exposed white king and potentially setting up a dangerous discovered attack on the d-file if the rook on e7 moves. The white monarch ventures out, a bold maneuver seeking to participate in the unfolding endgame and potentially threaten the opponent's vulnerable pawn structure, initiating a race against the clock to consolidate an advantage before the board simplifies further. Fighting for initiative, this pawn thrust, a bold pawn sacrifice, ignites the central landscape, disrupting white's already confined king. The aim is to pry open lines and generate counterplay, hoping to exploit any lingering weaknesses in white's coordination. It's a dynamic attempt to seize the reins of the game after a period of relative quiet, forcing white to react and potentially misstep. The king bravely steps forward to claim its central role, seeking to support the advanced pawns and potentially shield itself from further complications. The king, now liberated from its central prison, seeks a more active role, venturing out to embrace the open board and potentially participate in the upcoming skirmishes. Solidifying control over the weakened dark squares and preparing to reposition the bishop for potential future activity. Pushing the g-pawn here aims to create a kingside passer, a common endgame goal, but it might inadvertently weaken the king's shelter as the f-file becomes more exposed. Consider how this pawn advance impacts the coordination of your remaining pieces and whether it truly addresses white's growing influence. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure and preparing to advance the c-pawn to restrict black's bishop and potentially open a path for the queen. Opening a daring diagonal for the knight, this pawn thrust forcefully disrupts white's carefully constructed pawn shield, potentially creating weaknesses around the monarch or opening lines for counterplay. Your monarch finds himself in a precarious central position, desperately seeking refuge from the opposing bishop's menacing diagonal. A pawn advances, seeking to expand space on the kingside and potentially unblock the bishop on g7 for future activity, while simultaneously trying to hinder white's queenside pawn majority. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure is the immediate priority, aiming to create a more resilient defensive setup against black's active pieces. A desperate gambit to disrupt the king's defense, sacrificing material for a fleeting tactical opportunity. The pawn push opens the h-file, creating potential attacking lines against black's king, which is currently quite exposed in the center of the board, and simultaneously solidifies white's central pawn structure. Unleashing the pawn advance creates a dynamic intersection of opposing forces, forcing a crucial decision regarding the pawn structure and potential king safety. Unleashing the full power of the open file, this capture severs black's last defensive pawn chain and dramatically alters the endgame's character, presenting white with a clear path to promote. The pawn push to g4, though seemingly aggressive, opens up a critical pathway for your opponent's king. Black's capture of the pawn creates an immediate passed pawn on the h-file, a dangerous prospect in this rook and pawn endgame, demanding vigilant defense. Initiating a pawn roller to seize the queenside will be crucial for establishing an outpost for the knight and potentially creating a passed pawn. Black's attempt to force open the kingside with his pawn is a desperate gambit. The immediate aftermath will likely see white's king gain breathing room as the pawns are exchanged, creating a clearer path for white's pawns to advance and potentially trap black's remaining pieces. The knight hops forward, aiming to infiltrate the pawn structure and exploit black's exposed king position. The pawn's determined march to the 7th rank heralds a desperate attempt to seize the initiative, bypassing the looming threat of the knight and aiming for promotion, a classic endgame gamble to introduce complications and potentially disrupt white's solid positional advantage. A precarious king placement invites immediate danger. Seeking a safer haven for your monarch is paramount, as the opponent's bishop now has a clear path to create mating threats if the king remains exposed. This bishop's relocation to g4 is a proactive attempt to disrupt white's pawn structure and create immediate counterplay, potentially forcing concessions or opening lines for black's remaining pieces.